Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, I chat with Chelanga Langason of the CND NBA show and zone coverage in the Twin Cities to talk all about DAngelo Russell, what his season was like relative to expectations, and what do we expect from him next year? Will he be on the roster next year? We cover all of it today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked on Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked on T-Wolves. Don't forget the T, and at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. Very special show today. I have Chelanga Langason on the show. He is from Zone Coverage in the Twin Cities, does a great job writing over there, and also the co-host of the CND NBA podcast. He was my co-host for the Postcast. We did really early April through the month of April, the end of the regular season and the playoffs as well. So we talked DAngelo Russell. That's the entirety of the show today. A big D'Lo conversation. He's written a lot about him at Zone Coverage and has some pretty impassioned thoughts, I would say, about D'Lo. And we kind of talk about the whole gamut, his value, his contract, his potential trade value, what he did well this year, what he didn't, what we could expect for him moving forward with the team, his relationship with Chris FInch, all that stuff. So that's all coming up here right now on the show. All right, as promised, I have Chelanga Langason with me from the CND NBA show and Zone Coverage. Chelanga and I did all the live postcasts for, I guess, the end of the regular season, the start of the playoffs. And we were just talking before this. I mean, it's only been a couple of weeks, I think, and we're still not through the next round of the playoffs, but it feels like it's been, like a month, 6 weeks since the last Timberwolves game?
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like forever since I've watched the Wolves play basketball. And, we talked about it's a relief to sort of like be able to step back, review the season, especially after such a hard loss. It felt like really hard to be objective right away afterward. But, after a few weeks, I've been able to sort of reflect and realize, it's a good season. We're celebrating.
Yeah, and also watching like the rest of the playoffs, and obviously the Memphis Golden State series is it's most interesting to me, and I think to a lot of Wolves fans, just to see like how the Wolves have handled the Warriors, how are the Grizzlies handling it, and just to see some of the differences of how like Memphis is able to play against Golden State and vice versa. The way that the Wolves completely essentially made the Grizzlies change the way they played entirely, which I don't think got talked about enough. They just, one of the best teams in the league, just benched their starting center for basically the whole series. And now they're changing, back differently the way that, and obviously that's how playoff basketball works, but it's just so fascinating to me to look at it from more of an objective view. As you said, taking a step back from the Wolf season.
Absolutely. The playoffs in general, though, I mean, it's been awesome. This has been a great second round. I think whoever comes out of this round, we're in for a great conference finals as well.
Yeah, agreed. So what I've been doing on the show here at Locked On Wolves is going through the roster essentially from the least used players to the most used players. That means and doing player reviews for the season, expectations, or how players performed relative to expectations, I should say, and what to look for next year. What did this year tell us about that? Each player, their fit on the roster, what's the outlook moving forward? And so we're to the big three. I wanted to talk with Chelanga about DAngelo Russell. Because you've written a lot about D'Lo. We talked a little bit about him. Postcast, there were a couple of games where like he was, the playing game, he played such a big role. He had a couple of really bad games in the series against Memphis. And I want to start with, let's start with what the expectations were for D'Lo this year and how he performed relative to those, because I think it's really easy to lose that in light of his disappointing finish to the season. And very literally the last thing that Timberwolves fans and NBA fans remember of D'Lo this year was that bad game 6 he had against Memphis. And it wasn't the only bad playoff game he had, but coming into the season, there were a lot of question marks about how he would fit with the Timberwolves and the rest of their lineup. And frankly, with Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns. I mean, I think everyone knew that D'Lo Towns pairing was good, but you add another high usage player like Anthony Edwards. D'Lo and former head coach Ryan Saunders butted heads last year. They did not get along all that well. And there were some issues with D'Lo's overall fit on the court. The Wolves weren't good when he was on the court and Towns wasn't. So relative to expectations, you take a step back, and this, especially the first part of the season, minus when he was out with some injuries, I think was a really good start to the year for DeAngelo Russell, and was probably better than a lot of people expected him to be.
Yeah, I think like since D'Lo joined the squad, I've been. I think the best way to describe it is skeptical. Like I think, or critical, maybe is a fair word too. I mean, he's a max player. It was a really pivotal move for the Wolves, trading Andrew Wiggins and a first round pick for DeAngelo Russell. Like this was a huge, monumental move for the Wolves. And this year, I felt like he did a satisfactory job. Like he offensively came in huge. For much of the season, the Wolves offense really struggled when DeAngelo Russell wasn't on the floor. He took on like this real floor general sort of role, and he steadied the offense. He played with a pace. And when I say pace, I don't mean speed, but he would slow the offense down. He would get people set. He would call out plays. He added a steadiness throughout the season that I felt was really necessary, especially for such a young team. But I push back a little bit. I mean, a lot of people say like this was like, one of the best seasons of his career. And I think like, yes, we talk about the winning and we talk about the 7 assists per game, which is a career high, 7.1 assists per game. But like, you look at his advanced numbers and it's pretty on par with where he's been throughout his season, throughout his career, excuse me. And like outside of that one All-Star year in Brooklyn, I mean, his career best is like not max level player best. And so it's just hard to, have this huge salary on the books without that like same level of production on the court,
Yeah, no, I agree completely with that point, and I think that that's another layer of it's just such the I don't say argument. The conversation around DeAngelo Russell has to be very nuanced, and I mean, I think it all the conversation should be right. I think that we're in this hot takey world that we live in. We could too often be like, this player is great or this player is terrible. But with D'Lo, it's really interesting because there's so many layers. The contract adds another layer because I don't think there's any argument. I know that there's people that would make this argument, but I could not with a straight face make the argument that he's worth a max contract, that he's worth what he's being paid, that the Wolves should extend him to a max contract that's going to be 37 million or whatever if they do. And of course he's extension eligible. But I think at the same time, we can say he was a good player this year. He was a positive player. He was probably the Timberwolves, third or probably third best player, all things considered this year. And I think that both can be true. Now that doesn't mean you're getting requisite value for what his contract is. And I certainly don't think this was like head and shoulders the best year of his career. I think it was really on par with the Brooklyn Nets All-Star season. The shooting percentages, he actually had, I think, the best 2-point percentage of his career. He got to the line. His free throw rate was about, slightly above his career average, which is good. The 3-point percentage was his lowest in several years, which is, I think, probably more fluky than anything else. But to me, that was the biggest disappointment for him this year, was he just didn't hit his open 3-point attempts, either on the dribble or even catch and shoot. It was all down across the board for him. And the Wolves needed him to play that off the ball role, which is another thing I wanted to talk about. Is under Ryan Saunders, the Wolves just ran pick and rolls like crazy. And DeAngelo Russell and Karl-Anthony Towns are a dynamic pick and roll duo that remains true. And of course, we know that they only played 16, 17 games together last season, and they were slightly above 500 in those games. I'm talking about Towns and D'Lo. But this year, the Wolves did a lot more on offense than just pick and roll. And they asked Anthony Edwards to initiate a lot more offense and D'Lo to play off the ball. And they almost kind of depended on the matchup. It depended on who had the hot hand. But the Wolves would those guys would occasionally take turns on who was playing off the ball more often. And D'Lo accepted that role, and by all accounts was a good teammate and did a pretty good job. And I wonder if next year, if he just simply shoots the ball at where he's been for his career, 37.5, 38% from three instead of whatever he was, 34%, I think this year. Is it really that much different of a performance? Like, does he suddenly have, averages a few more points per game? He's more efficient. The Wolves offense flows better when he makes those threes. I don't know. To me, that seems like something that could bounce back. next year.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Earlier, you kind of talked about D'Lo and Ryan Saunders' relationship, and like we moved to this year, and I still think the coach-player relationship. I, I don't know how good it is because we saw at I mean, he was benched for the last 5 minutes of the winner go
Yeah.
home game, and I just think like if like knowing how Chris Finch likes to play basketball, I think that if he went into a lab and he you know punched in the formula for his perfect point guard to lead his offense, I don't think that point guard would look anything like D'Angelo Russell. I think it would look a lot more like Jordan McLaughlin.
Yep.
I think about like Alonzo Ball type, like
Yeah.
a stout defender, someone who's going to push the pace, move the ball, just get the offense going. Like that's kind of what seems like what Finch wants in a point guard, and that's not D'Angelo Russell. And so that's going to be a dynamic that's going to be super important to watch moving forward. Like, how does Finch pull that string? Because you listen to D'Lo talk in his exit interview, and he was not happy about sitting on the bench. The quote I think John Kay asked him how he felt about that. He said, "Do you want to do your job? Do you want to tweet about this?" He's like, I mean, he was clearly upset. So that dynamic is going to be super interesting to watch.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also this is maybe I'm reading too much into the well, I don't know. I think it speaks for itself, but look at the other point guards the Timberwolves have brought in, obviously backup types since Finch has been on board. None of them look like D'Angelo Russell. They all look more like Jordan McLaughlin. Look at the two-way, McKinley Wright on the two-way deal.
Yeah.
The Summer League and G League Exhibit 10 guy, Isaiah Miller, was much more of a defensive minded, get to the basket, less of a jump shooter, less of a high usage guy. Anybody that they've given the ball to at the point, with the exception of, I guess, Jalen Noel, who's not actually a point guard, is somebody who looks more like a Jordan McLaughlin. And then you can go back. I mean, that's actually a pretty telling thing. I mean, like, look at all the other guys that like Tom Thibodeau brought in. They looked a lot more like a high usage point guard than the guys that are preferred by Chris Finch. Chris Finch talked highly of Ricky Rubio last year, talked about how he'd always wanted to have him on his team, another low usage, defensive minded, guard. So I agree with you. I don't think that Finch and Russell are a match made in heaven. I think that they appreciated each other for what they could do. And I speak in past tense. I imagine Russell's still on the team next year. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that they appreciate each other and are professionals, but at the same time, it's not, like you said, in a lab is probably the best way to say it. It's not how Finch would have drawn it up necessarily, kind of inherited him. Um, yeah, I mean, what in terms of sitting here right now, what do you think was the most encouraging thing about D'Lo's season? All things considered, despite the way the season ended, what encouraged you in terms of what you think he might be able to bring to the table next year, assuming he's on the team? Where does this marriage between the Wolves' big three to each other and also with Chris Finch, where does it go next, and what's D'Lo's role in that?
Yeah, I think the encouraging thing is that when he really is in the zone and running the offense, I think the offense really moves, and like he can be really excellent operating in the pick and roll. And he spoke a little bit about this in his in his exit interview as well, about he and Karl's like pick and roll dynamic. Is that it was a little bit rocky because they were both kind of in and out for a lot of the year. There was that COVID stretch where they couldn't really get going, but once they kind of started to find their groove, it it's a really hard attack to stop when you've got Anthony Edwards, Karl-Anthony Towns, and D'Angelo Russell. And Anthony Edwards is shooting like 42% off catch and shoot threes. Karl-Anthony Towns is a 3-level scorer, and you really have to worry about D'Angelo Russell's mid-range shooting. When he's able to manipulate the defense out of the pick and roll and really, find his guys, that was really good. And that looked really good. And we saw that with his 7.1 assists per game and, his quality assist percentage. I mean, that to me, that's like the best version of D'Lo, when he's looking for his guys, trying to set people up and taking smart shots,
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about some lineup data here next. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at Built Bar. Imagine dipping your finger into a plastic tub of birthday cake frosting and opening your eyes and realizing that it was only 150 calories and 16 grams of protein. That's what it's like to eat a birthday cake puff from Built. Apparently, there's some on the way. I can't wait to receive them. If you haven't tried puffs, I'll let you in a little secret. Built puffs are delicious. They're protein bars. They're marshmallowy. You can make every day your birthday with the Built birthday cake puffs. Built has taken the delicious experience of biting into a fresh slice of birthday cake enrobed in 100% white chocolate and added sprinkles with 150 calories, 16 grams of protein, and only 9 grams of sugar. This limited time flavor is an amazing option if you're looking for a healthy way to get flavor and variety in your day. Go to built.com, use promo code LOCK15, get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com.
Yo, I gotta send David Locke an email here. I'm trying to get myself some Built Bars. That sounds delicious.
They're legit. They're amazing.
Oh my goodness.
They're really, really good. I have not had the birthday cake one.
Okay.
And any day now. But they're fantastic.
I've always wondered because the lockdown hosts, they always say that, like, and so like the fact that I'm here now and you're telling me they're actually delicious, I'm like, I'm all in.
No, they are 100%. And like, I don't really like protein bars. I don't really like anything in that genre in general, but they're really, really good. The puffs, they're like essentially just like anything with marshmallow in them. They don't taste like they're healthy. They're really, really good. So be sure to check them out at built.com. Again, lock 15 for 15% off your order at built.com.
All right.
All right. Let's talk about some lineup data. So I think this is really interesting. Of the Timberwolves top, well, this is one way to look at it. The Wolves easily their best 4 lineups that were used at any, I think I put in 75 minutes basically for in terms of 5-man lineups. DAngelo Russell is in all of them. So is the Timberwolves big 3. It's not surprising that he's in all the best lineups. And the common denominator here, I think, is that he actually, let me say it this way. The best lineup that the Timberwolves put out there had Malik Beasley with Karl-Anthony Towns, DAngelo Russell, Jared Vanderbilt, and Anthony Edwards. So basically it's the Wolves' preferred starters, but no Beverly, and Beasley's in the lineup. This surprised me a little bit. And it was used far less than the actual starting lineup, obviously. But D'Lo playing next to a lower usage guy like Patrick Beverly that's different from what he did last year when Beasley was in the starting lineup virtually every game that he played in. And I think it goes back to how Chris FInch wants to use D'Lo, using him off the ball a little bit more, using Patrick Beverly to initiate offense, using Anthony Edwards to initiate offense. And I wonder if, what that does to DAngelo Russell's value and how much that makes sense. Like, I guess this can kind of transition into the conversation about his value for next year, his contract. Does he have trade value? Does he return? If the Wolves are going to use him essentially as a third wheel in the offense, is he going to be okay with that? Is he worth the contract that he's going to get paid? And can the Wolves replicate that in some other way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, really interesting. I'm going to bring it back to his exit interview one more time, just because I think it was so telling. Like, he's not always super forthcoming in his interviews, but he actually gave some pretty insightful answers. And he talked a lot about how he's never really been in a position where he wasn't at the top of the game plan. And so he feels like, since he's kind of the third banana here, he was really figuring out how to fit in this offense in that way. And I think towards the end of the year, we started to hear him say things like, I'm not a point guard, I'm just a guard. And so there's this like change that's happening, I think, in DAngelo Russell's own mind about like who he is as a basketball player, and specifically who he is on the Minnesota Timberwolves, which I think long-term value for the Wolves, if his mindset is starting to become like a little bit lower usage, more of an off the ball type of guy who, the catch and shoot type of guy, I think ultimately that's really good for the Timberwolves like ceiling, because as Anthony Edwards progresses, we're going to start to see the ball in his hands a lot more. At least that's what I expect. And I think the peak version of Anthony Edwards has the ball in his hands a lot. And so the more that D'Lo can slot into that role as the secondary playmaker, the secondary creator, the better it is for the Wolves. But then we run into this contract issue because he's already made his max money. And so like he's got his rate. I don't know if you watch I Think You Should Leave, but there's a hilarious scene where Santa Claus plays a secret agent, or he plays the FBI, and he talks about how he made $2 million in the movie. And no matter how good or bad he does in the movie, he made $2 million. That's his rate. And that's how much he's making for his next movie. And so that's what I feel like with DAngelo Russell. Like he's kind of stuck at that rate.
Yeah. And what happens next for him? Because I talked about this, I think it might've been the first episode I did right after the season ended. Like, what do you do with DAngelo Russell? Because you can't, like we said earlier, I don't think with a straight face can make the argument he's worth $37 million a year. and he's still just entering his prime, right? He's only going to be
Uh-huh.
26 this next year, so it's not like he's necessarily on the backside of his prime, but he's got some knee issues. He hasn't really played. I mean, he's played what? He's only played more than 65 games once in a season in his career, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Um, and for a player who doesn't play above the rim, and he's not, he's certainly not ultra athletic or anything like that. So there's, what do you do with him? Is he even tradable at his current contract? Yes, he's expiring. I would imagine the Wolves would be able to trade him, but you also don't want to give him away for pennies on the dollar. So um, it's really fascinating. And I said this before on the show. I think the most likely scenario is he's on the team all of next year, and they simply let him walk next summer. I don't know what else you do.
I mean it's tough because I think about like that 33 million he's got next year, that might look pretty appealing to a team at the trade deadline who's maybe in the middle of a season that's not going their way
Yeah.
and they want to reconfigure. I mean, we saw sort of Portland tear it down this year, and New Orleans was able to get a lot of value for not that much,
Hmm.
and so there's way. I can't put together that way because there's too many unknowns. Um, but I think at this point, like teams probably value D'Angelo Russell more as that expiring than as the actual basketball player D'Angelo Russell, just because it's only 1 year and then it's like he's either going to walk or you're going to have to pay him a lot of money. And so it's just tough to trade him because he's good, but he's not great. And
Right.
and so it's just he's in a tough spot, you know?
Yeah. And uh, I think that's definitely possible. I think the one thing with the trade deadline is like it, we have no idea how good the Wolves will be next year, but say that they stay on a similar trajectory and they're similar, maybe a little bit better. They're showing improvement. They're in the thick of the playoffs, 5, 6 seed around the trade deadline in the Western Conference. It's like, is that the sort of shakeup that you pull off, or do you just kind of stand pat and see what happens? And of course, then Minnesota is not known for attracting free agents in the offseason. Do you really think you can go, big game hunting in the offseason and sign somebody to fill that space? Or do you trade him and try and get some assets and then flip some of the assets in another deal in the offseason? There's so many different possibilities, obviously.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not like if this were the Wolves a year ago, like say everything was a year and the Wolves were, won 23 games this year, then obviously you'd be saying like, let's trade him now. Let's trade him at the deadline. Let's trade him on
Right.
draft night. But now it's like he was a big part of the Timberwolves' success. How do we value? And of course, there's the front office thing too. Sachin Gupta isn't officially hired as the full-time president of basketball operations. He's just kind of acting in that role now. And Chris Finch, I mean, both of their fates are tied to the new ownership situation. So there's so many things here that are just like you have to consider. And I think the most likely scenario, especially if Gupta's in charge, is they just kind of stand pat again
Yeah.
and see what happens in the fall. And then, depending on how the season goes, we could see fireworks at the deadline.
Yeah, it certainly seems like thus far that's been Gupta's MO. I think that Rosas was clearly the more aggressive of the two. And so yeah, I can see that. And like I think too the final scenario that we can game out is like an opportunity for a sign and trade because of the Timberwolves books the next off season. There's room for them to pull off a sign and trade without getting into too much hard cap trouble. I'm no like cap space expert, but I think there's a way for them to figure that out. Um, and that's not obviously sign and trades. You don't get full value, but you at least get some value back. And so I think like if D'Angelo Russell is in a position where it's like no matter what you trade him, you're not getting equal value. Like a sign and trade is a decent option because then at least you play it out. You talk about contract negotiations. If the numbers don't match, then you try to see what you can get for him. But again, he is just entering his prime, and I don't think that his game should age that poorly. Obviously, he's not super fast or athletic. He stays on the ground. And so like as he continues as his like brain continues to develop and his like ability to manipulate the defense with his handle, with his sort of like herky jerky moves, as he like gets more craft and chemistry with Karl-Anthony Towns in the pick and roll, I don't see why he can't maintain this level or even get a little bit better than where he's at right now.
That's a really interesting point. I want to come back to that, and then we'll close this out with some final thoughts on D'Lo First, let's talk about our partners over at BetOnline. Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's NBA playoffs, MLB scores, fights, and even next season's NFL futures. By the way, the lines for the playoffs are super fascinating always to me. The line for the Bucks, Celtics at the Bucks on Friday night is -1.5. The Bucks are favored, and Golden State's 8-point favorites over Memphis in that game at Golden State on Friday night. I can't really argue with either of those. That seems about right. Betting online is your continued source for all your sport wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. Bet online, where the game starts. All right, so Chelanga, you're making the point regarding D'Lo's game and it aging. We talked a minute ago about like, hey, he's had his max contract, but he's only he just turned 26 in February, so he's going into his age 26 season. And you talked about his game not aging that poorly. And I think we've already seen this year, maybe for me, what actually made him in a vacuum have a better season than he had certainly the last few, going back to his All-Star season with the Nets, is all related to his experience now. So the defense, we haven't even talked about his defense. He still was a below average defender, but for much of the year, he was, you could call him kind of average in terms of, players who primarily play point guard, their on-ball defense. He actually, the effort was there in defending the pick and roll. And frankly, it hadn't been in previous seasons, really anywhere, certainly in Golden State. When he first came to Minnesota, some of his time in Brooklyn, he just didn't try hard. He's a big-bodied player. He's intelligent. He is relatively long. Even though he's not super athletic, he should be able to be adequate in terms of being an on-ball defender, to defend in the pick and roll, be somewhat switchable. And he hadn't been until this year. And then on the other side of the floor on offense, we saw him get to the line more than ever before. He had a career-high free throw rate. We saw him draw a lot of fouls on the rip through move on the perimeter. Again, being crafty, getting his head and shoulders past guys and shooting leaners and floaters, and some of those things that, harken to a little bit of like a really light version of James Harden type of a deal. So free throw rate, the assist rate still kind of staying where it had been. Well, the turnover rate ticked down a little bit. The free throw rate, I mentioned the 3-point rate, even though he wasn't making his threes, he was shooting more threes. So he's playing a little bit more of an analytically friendly offensive game while still competing on defense. And I think those are all things that if the knees do continue to go, or I guess we don't know if they're going, but he's had issues. He's had knee issues. There's no question about that. He could still be an effective scorer. The question is, will the defensive effort continue to be there? And does he make enough threes as a high volume 3-point shooter to make his offensive game genuinely valuable as well?
Right. I think the thing for me about his defense that we saw in the playoffs that it becomes a liability. There were a lot of times where Memphis, and we saw it with the Clippers as well, they hunted DAngelo Russell, and you just really have to make it up on the offensive end if you are going to be hunted defensively. I mean, we even saw that with like a Trae Young, who DAngelo Russell's a better defender than Trae Young, but like him being on the floor makes it really hard for the Hawks defense to like make up the difference. And so D'Lo, his more analytically friendly offensive game, I think that is key moving forward, because that has not always been his game. He has been sort of a mid-range monster in some good ways and some bad ways. But the more that he can sort of focus on, getting those fouls, which he's really good at, that 3-point shooting, and really pick his spots in the mid-range, the better it will be for the Wolves moving forward.
Yeah, to your point regarding the playoffs, I mean, people said that about, it's funny because for so long, the Wolves made the playoffs once in 17 years. So I remember people talk about Ricky Rubio, like, you can hide him, you can hide him on the, you don't have to, teams have to guard him essentially in the regular season. But when it comes down to it in crunch time or of a game that matters, you don't have to guard him. We saw the same thing with Jared Vanderbilt at times, although the Wolves were more creative with Vando, I think. But he got played off the floor a couple of times in the Memphis series. They, you couldn't really take D'Lo off the floor, although Finch did at the end of game 6. But Memphis targeted him just like the Wolves targeted John Morant on the other end of the floor. I mean, you could do those things, and teams are willing to do that in a long, drawn-out series where it's like, hey, let's try this. This is really working. We're just like the Wolves spent an entire game essentially isoing Patrick Beverley, which didn't happen at all in the regular season because they were like, hey, let's just our fourth option is better than your worst defender. And that's what teams were doing to D'Lo.
Yep.
And that is an issue in crunch time of any game. And then certainly throughout playoff games.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, like, I am happy with the Wolves being good. I'm down with rooting for a good basketball team. We could talk about championship aspirations. We could talk about ceiling, but like, to be in Minnesota and to be a Wolves fan and to be able to like watch a playoff game, come on now. It's totally worth whatever happens, like I don't want to take that for granted because it was really like special this season.
Yeah, and to, I guess, to end on that note, I mean, my take on D'Angelo Russell, if we're just gonna, I guess, try and put a bow on this, is anything could happen this offseason. I mean, anything really could happen, from an extension to a trade to nothing. Those are all possible. And I think the Wolves can continue to be good and continue to improve with D'Lo on the roster next year, even if they extend him, which I wouldn't do if I were the Timberwolves. I would not give him a max extension. But they could continue to improve because he's still entering his prime. He made some improvements this year. Ant's obviously going to get better. The question is, can you make the rest of the roster better around them? If D'Lo and if Cat's on a super max, D'Lo's on a max, and you got to pay Ant, eventually Jaden McDaniels. Can you continue to draft well in the second round? The Wolves have 3 second-round picks this year. Can you continue to acquire veterans at modest costs and do a good job on the trade market and with your exceptions and build talent around this group? What does that ceiling look like? I think very clearly, as we've seen, the floor is a good team, a competitive playoff team, probably even a team that could get home court advantage next year, or a 4 or 5 seed. But what is the ceiling? And that, I think, is the question the Timberwolves are going to have to ask themselves: is do we just take another go at this and see how good we can be next year and then figure it all out next summer, or do we try and shake things up now? And I think that's the job of the front office and ownership to try and figure that out.
Absolutely. Get in the playoff mix and anything can happen. You never know. But it's a tough choice. But for now, the Wolves are back, baby.
That's right. That's a perfect note to end on. I appreciate you taking the time, Chelanga.
Yeah,
if you haven't, or go ahead and plug your stuff.
Yeah, follow me at Chelangason. That's CHELANGASON on Twitter. I tweet all the time, mostly nonsense and a little bit of basketball. And read me at Zone Coverage. That's where you get like the real, thoughtful, and I try to be insightful when I write. So read my stuff at Zone Coverage.
I appreciate that. We need more insightful writers. That's what we need.
Hey,
all right, I appreciate you coming on, and we'll do this again soon.
All right, peace, man.
See ya. All right, that's all we have for today here on the show. Thanks again for listening to Locked On Wolves and for making us your first listen every single day. Of course, you can find the show everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, Locked On Wolves is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. And as long as you're making us your first listen, go ahead and consider your second listen to be Locked On NBA. From the first jump ball, the play-in tournament, to the last possession of the finals, Locked On experts take you deep inside the playoffs with insight and analysis affecting all 30 teams. We'll be back on Monday through Friday shows, of course, next week. Be sure to keep it here at Locked On Wolves. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast. We'll catch you next time.